So we're doing a specialized study. This study is based on a re-release of a book by Matthew Vines. Initially came out about 10 years ago called God and the Gay Christian. It's been re-released and expanded here in this past year in 2025. And I've been reading it and pulling out some bits and pieces that I think have added to our understanding of certain things. And I've done a little bit of my own research. And I want to share some additional elements regarding the topic tonight. And as we get into it tonight, one of the things that we're going to do is we are going to look at a couple of passages of scripture. And I know we've looked at these before, but in the last 10 years, thus the title of this study, 10 years later, there's been some additional insight that I think we can benefit from. And so tonight we're going to look at a couple of passages of scripture that we've looked at before, but I think I want to approach it from a little bit different angle. And I think it might be helpful for us to see what is the point of a couple of these passages that are often used or misused by various people. And so the way to get into it is to talk a little bit tonight about why non-affirming beliefs about same gender relationships should be reconsidered. I think we introduced it last week, but I want to reemphasize that there is a harmful impact that it can make upon people. And then secondly, uh, the understanding that some people are permanently and exclusively attracted to the same gender is a more recent development, as I showed you this particular thing that was in last week's handout, the complexity of the subject regarding gender identity, assigned gender at birth, gender expression, sexual orientation, and romantic orientation. So, while gay people can theoretically get married to someone of the opposite sex, it is something that probably should be considered deeply regarding whether that particular marriage to someone of the opposite gender would actually last. And you can see 3 points at the bottom of the slide. Research suggests that 1/3 of marriages may end immediately upon somebody that's coming out to their spouse saying, I'm actually gay. Secondly, although a mixed orientation marriage may not end in divorce, it will definitely change the family dynamic. We hear a lot of that when we were attending the PFLAG meetings a number of years ago. And then thirdly, in many cases, neither partner may have fallen out of love with each other because someone has come out, yet their lives have been changed, and they need to adjust. And so one of the things that we learned at PFLAG is there were some transgender folks that came out after they had been married to someone, and they made the adjustments, and they were able to continue to carry on their union together. So, what we want to do tonight is we want to take a look at what is often suggested by those who are non-affirming. I think in recent years, a number of people have suggested, well, okay, individuals that are gay, they have an orientation that way, but while they are gay, they should still be celibate in order to be obedient to God. And so Christians throughout history have affirmed that celibacy is an option. In fact, we're going to look at a passage here in a second about that. But those who are non affirming want to impose celibacy upon someone who is gay. And I think what we'll see here in a second is that it is not something that can be forced upon someone else. And yet, that is the only viable option to a non affirming position that is offered to a gay Christian. So when we think about the old Adam and Eve narrative that is often referred to, it's interesting that everything in creation in Genesis chapter 2 was good except one thing, and that is Adam, the one from the ground, was alone, and it was not good that he lived in isolation. And in the Genesis 2 passage, I think it's interesting that the purpose of providing a partner, Eve, was not so that procreation was the only and most important reason. God gives a partner to be a partner to someone who is in isolation because animals couldn't fill that role. And God was providing someone who is more similar than animals, someone who's a human being. And that's kind of what the Genesis 2:18 and 20 is talking about when it talks about someone who is suitable, a suitable helper. And a literal translation of that is literally someone similar to himself. And so, even before the idea of procreation comes into play in the text, the idea is one of loneliness, and it's the idea of providing someone to do life with in the text in Genesis. So when people say celibacy is the option for someone who has a gay orientation, we have to reconsider that because it's interesting passage in Matthew chapter 19. So if you have a Bible, I'm going to turn there. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is being set up. That's the context. In chapter 18, there's this ongoing um, conflict that's taking place with some of the religious leaders. And by the time you get to the end of chapter 18, you have Jesus talking about various things, and then verse 1 says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him. That's important to keep in mind. Some have come to test him, and they're going to give him a difficult question. And here it is. They ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? A lot of context behind that question. At the time, there was two predominant views on divorce. One was a person could divorce their wife for any reason. The other one was except for the case of adultery. And so they put Jesus on the spot. Now, the way he responds is interesting here. It says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, that's the important concept there. Most people concentrate on the male and female element of it, but it's the idea of one flesh, that two people have joined together in lifelong partnership. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, what's interesting is how the disciples respond to that. They listen in to Jesus' response to the Pharisees. And they say, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Obviously, divorce was a part of the text of the Old Testament. And Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery. So Jesus is going to land on the stricter of the two positions of his day. Then the disciples make a comment. They said, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, that they can't divorce for any reason, it's better not to marry. So now the subject of celibacy comes into place here. And Jesus replies, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. So notice the reply of Jesus. He's saying that celibacy can only be accepted by those to whom it has been given. In other words, whether they're born that way or they choose that, it's not for everyone. And to impose celibacy on someone as an implication from the text would be trying to get someone to do something as difficult as switching their dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, no, we want you to use your left hand, or vice versa. The principle, I think, is this. Celibacy is not to be imposed on someone. Not everyone can do it. Not everyone has that gift. And to suggest that gay Christians that do not have a gift of celibacy should live out their celibacy as a way of being obedient to God has misread really the idea of some people being able to accept a certain gift, others do not have that gift. So maybe a principle from this passage we could think of is to say that every gay Christian should remain celibate for their entire life, and should not be given the right to get married to someone they love is actually causing more damage and harm because it's not a gift that has been given to them, or it's not a gift that they have chosen to make the sacrifices for. So the key question then becomes, well, then why did Jesus mention male and female? I don't think he's necessarily emphasizing the necessity of gender difference in marriage. I think what he is suggesting here is when you go on further in the Torah, Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 5, the the tendency had become that a patriarchal society could justify divorcing their wife for any reason. And Jesus is pulling back on that and saying, no, these individuals have made a commitment. They are one flesh. And this is the stresses on the union of two people. And he is using the context of the Torah where there is marriage, there is male and female, because that was the context of the day. We live in a very different context in our day and age. So the key here, I think, is Jesus is not mandatory demand of celibacy for those who have not been given the gift, but neither should they be in a marital relationship haphazardly or for it to be taken lightly. That it is a very deep, committed relationship. And so the disciples said, well, why would we want to go into that relationship if we don't have more options in front of us? And then Jesus talks about eunuchs and those who are born that way, those who have been made that way, and those who choose that way. So I don't think that's a good option to tell a gay person, well, I know that you're gay, but however, your only option is you have to live a celibate life. It doesn't seem Jesus is embracing that in this passage of scripture. So one of the other passages of scripture that comes into play, we've talked about this. I'm only going to remind you of it, and then I'm going to kind of go in a different direction with it so that we might gain some additional insight. So in Genesis 19, you know the story. The story is really beginning in chapter 18, where God visits Abraham and Sarah. Sarah is barren, and there's a promise made that Sarah is going to have a child. And these angels who are in disguise as human beings, then are going to move on to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in chapter 18, Abraham says, are you going to destroy the righteous along with the wicked? And he becomes a mediator, and he says, if there's 50 righteous, are you still going to destroy the city? And he begins to negotiate down all the way to 10. But what's interesting here is at the beginning of chapter 18, what is actually singled out in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, is not so much the mediation of Abraham, but his hospitality. And he welcomes these two strangers in. He doesn't know they're angels at first, but what we find is that he's going to welcome them, provide for them, and be a cultural important value, and that is of hospitality. So when we come to Genesis 19, the context suggests Abraham is a holy man because he's a hospitable man. The angels move on to Sodom and Gomorrah. And as they move on there, they meet up with Lot. And in Genesis chapter 19, Lot is very hospitable as well. He welcomes these two people. He takes them to his place. In fact, he insists on it because in Genesis 19, verse 1, it says, the two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot, for whatever reason, was sitting in the gateway of the city. And when he saw them, he got up to meet them. He bowed down with his face to the ground. My lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning. So he extends to them hospitality. They respond by saying, no, we're going to spend the night in the square. Now, Lot knows well enough that that's not a good idea. So at the beginning of chapter 19, he shows them hospitality. They say, no, we're going to spend the night in the city square. Verse 3 says, he insists so strongly that they did go with him and enter his house. So he provides a meal for them. And what we find is that as they are in residence, before they'd gone to bed, but after dinner, the men of the city surround the house. And it says here in verse 4, before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. So this is kind of like military formation language. They surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them. Now, you know where people have gone with this. The whole town was homosexuals, and they want to have sex with these two angels. What we find is that that's not really the way the text is reading. What we find is they are surrounding the house. The imagery is such of attack. And what we find throughout the Old Testament is every time these two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, are mentioned together, there's a condemnation. And sometimes you have to piece it together in some of these passages like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos and Zephaniah. But Ezekiel is the one that really gives to us the clearest answer here as to why they were condemned. So in chapter 16 of Ezekiel, it says in verse 49 and 50 here, it says, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. So nothing is mentioned here about sex, but what is mentioned here is arrogance, injustice, violence, those type of things that were directed toward these individuals. same-sex behavior goes unmentioned in Ezekiel. Now, what we find is interesting. So I think Ezekiel's clear, but if you have a Bible like the Oxford Annotated Bible that has the Apocrypha in it, you'll read different things in what is called the Apocrypha. And I'm just going to read a couple of verses because it's in alignment with Ezekiel. So, in the Wisdom of Solomon, it says this uh, the punishments did not come upon the sinners without prior signs in the violence of thunder, for they justly suffered because of their wicked acts, for they practiced a more bitter hatred of strangers. Others had refused to receive strangers when they came to them, but these made slaves of guests who were their benefactors. And not only so, but while punishment of some sort will come upon the former for having received strangers with hostility, the latter having first received them with festal celebrations, afterward afflicted with terrible sufferings those who already shared the same rights. So the Wisdom of Solomon is saying here that they did not receive strangers, that they were hostile to strangers. And if you keep reading in some of the cross references here in the Apocrypha, in the book of Syriac, chapter 16, it says in verse 8, he did not spare the neighbors of Lot, whom he loathed on account of their arrogance. So arrogance, hostility, those type of things. And then lastly, in the book of Third Maccabees, chapter 19, verse 15, it says this here. Find it. No, verse 5, not 15. That's wrong on the screen. You consumed with fire and sulfur the people of Sodom who acted arrogantly, who were notorious for their vices. So the I think what the additional research that has come about in the last 10 years has begun to think about that what happened in Sodom was a gang rape. It's not sexual attraction. Now, why would they want to gang rape these two angels? In the ancient world, it's been discovered that for a man to be raped was to be considered the ultimate degradation, the ultimate way of being humiliated. And what's fascinating is the cultural taboo is kind of reflected in the parallel story of Judges 19. So in Exodus, what does Lot do? He says, no, no, don't take these men and do this hostile thing toward them. He offers them his daughters uh, as a replacement for the two angels. There you'll find the same story repeated in a in parallel to Judges chapter 19. Now, this is an interesting cross reference here. In Judges chapter 19, we're told about a Levite and his concubine. And it says here, in those days, Israel had no king. Well, what the author's saying, what the editors are saying is what's implied. Because they had no king, they did what was right in their own eyes. That's kind of the tagline of the book of Judges. Now, a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem in Judah, rather. So she's unfaithful. She goes back to her parents. And after she had been there a period of 4 months, this Levite wants to persuade her to return home. So he goes to the parents' house. As he goes to the parents' house, ironically, both the parents and the concubine welcome him in. So there's that hospitality element again. And so he stays there a period of 3 days. And on the fourth day, he's going to move on. And it says in verse 5, on the fourth day, they got up early and he prepared to leave. But the woman's father said to the son in law, refresh yourself with something to eat, then you can go. So he convinces him to spend another day. And then we're told on the fifth day, he rose to go. Same thing, refresh yourself, so on and so forth. Okay, so the story goes on, and by the time you get down a little bit, as he's insisting it's time for him to leave, he is given this advice. We won't go into any city whose people are not Israelites. Why? There's some hostility awaiting them. So then it says in verse 16, that evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the inhabitants of the place were Benjamites. So, safe place, right? Israelites. Came in from his work in the fields. And when he looked, he saw the traveler, this is the Levite, in the city square. There's the parallel. Where did the angels want to go? To the city square. He goes to the city square. The old man asked, where are you going, and where did you come from? And he answered, we're on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, where I live. So there's the first parallel. Then here comes the hospitality. Verse 20. The old man says, you are welcome at my house. Let me supply whatever you need, only don't spend the night in the square. So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys, and after they washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. And while they were enjoying themselves, same thing, they're eating. Remember the Sodom passage. They're eating. And then when they're done, here come some men pounding at the door. Verse 22 says, while they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. Same thing as the Sodom passage. What are they doing that for? They are going to violate him as a way of punishing him and embarrassing him and so forth. But the owner of the house went outside and he intervenes, just like Lot did. The owner of the house went outside and said to them, no, my friends, don't be so vile. That's what the Apocrypha said. The vileness of humanity. Census man is my guest. Don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. Take them. Parallel. And so what these men do, it says, but the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. So this concubine that the Levite came to rescue and bring back home is pushed out the door, sent her outside, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. And it says here, when her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, get up, let's go. But there's no answer. And then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. And when he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. She was already dead. And he puts her on the animal and he cuts her up and sends pieces and parts to the tribes as a way of communicating how vile this that humanity has become, that this concubine had been raped to death. So all kinds of parallels with the Sodom story, and none of it really has to do with sex. It has to do with violence. It has to do with prejudice. It has to do with racism. It has to do with hostility and dominance and all those type of things. And so hopefully this parallel story, which is written in light of the fact that you have this story of Sodom already among the folklore of this new nation, it follows it to the T, basically, as a way of communicating what the vile sin was. So anytime someone begins to talk about uh, Genesis 19 and the story of Sodom, I think it's important to cross-reference over to Judges 19 because it plays a critical part in showing what it's trying to communicate, along with Ezekiel and some of the other passages we read. So maybe this is a way we can summarize this. When you talk about the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, it is not one specific sin, it's a cluster of sins. It's a cluster of evil, violence, sexual coercion, inhospitality, arrogance, moral corruption. And the Genesis narrative intentionally is portraying something here. It's portraying a society so degraded that no single label is sufficient to tell us what mankind has become. And so, as we know, compound sin is still a part of what is going on in the world, and we're seeing it every day in the news. And so, yes, are the individual things important? Absolutely. But they add to a bigger picture. And I think that's ultimately what the Sodom and Gomorrah story is talking about. So recent research has suggested that um, Sodom, in its cultural context, was supposed to be hospitable to strangers. It was a sacred virtue in the ancient world. They violated it, and throughout the scripture, it was considered a catastrophic failure on their part. So this helps us to reframe the story. This isn't so much about private morality between two people. It's about public communal evil and the abuse of power. And the public square is the symbol of those who hold that power and allow society to dehumanize other people. So that's one passage. And I think the additional insight has helped us see a bigger picture on it than just pulling a verse out and using it as a condemnation toward a particular group of people. Ironically enough, when people do that, they are doing the very thing that is being condemned in the passage. All right. There are some New Testament references to Sodom. We're not going to look at them tonight, but if you want to read them, there's a couple of passages in the Gospels. There's a couple of passages in the uh, epistles. So, how did we get to this point where using the Sodom story becomes this means of condemning a whole group of people? Well, there was a guy by the name of Philo that lived in Alexandria, Egypt. He was the first biblical interpreter to explicitly link Sodom's sin to same sex behavior. And so this is in the 5th century AD, before Philo makes that popular. Um, it was considered this cluster of sins. Philo, though, is not describing same-sex behavior as an expression of sexual orientation. It's, in his opinion, it was a sign that people are overindulging in a normal desire. And Philo goes on and he says, after these individuals slept around, they could go back and have sex with the opposite sex, women. But Philo takes a unique interpretation on that. And it's picked up by some of the other early writers in the fourth century. They begin to adopt Philo's point of view. And by the late fourth century, a guy by the name of John Chrysostom, he is quite the orator, one of the best preachers in the ancient world, said that God punished the city for same-sex transgressions. He he had such a eloquence about him in the way he communicated. It was very powerful, and it had a very influential impact upon people who listened to him. A little bit later, St. Augustine backed that same interpretation by Philo and John Chrysostom at the start of the fifth century. As you know, Augustine is a theologian, and he began to systematize this and talk about it as males with uncontrollable lust. And by the time you get to the Middle Ages, same-sex relationships um, replaced inhospitality as the dominant interpretation of the Sodom and Gomorrah narrative. So, with that in mind, what we have seen here is an interpretive shift has taken place, and it's been carried on for hundreds of years. And it's been reinforced by other stories too. I'm not going to turn to this passage, but in Genesis 38, there's this strange passage. It's a story about a father by the name of Judah who had three sons. His oldest son marries a woman by the name of Tamar, and that son dies. And according to the text, he is judged for some vile evil, and God takes his life. Um, he has a brother by the name of Onan. And Judah says that it is the obligation of Onan to carry on the family line by having a sexual relationship with Tamar. And so Judah pressures Onan to sleep with Tamar to produce offspring because that's his uh, uh, family and societal duty, according to Deuteronomy 25. But he has sex with Tamar, and before he is about to come, he pulls out and he spills his seed on the ground, and as a result of that, he does not carry out his obligation to impregnate Tamar so that she can have a family. The legacy of Onan's brothers at stake here. He refuses to carry out the family obligation. So this is a story really about what he is supposed to do now that his brother is dead. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, this story about Onan spilling his seed um, was taken down the road to condemn, number one, masturbation, and number two, about any type of sexual activity outside of the purposes of procreation. And so the Middle Ages became kind of this oppressed society where the only reason you have sex is if you want to have children. Um, One of the early church fathers by the name of Jerome believed that sex was permissible only when the married couple was consciously trying to procreate. Otherwise, they should not engage in that relationship. So you see this interpretive shift has taken place over a number of years. And as a result of that, um, I think we have been misreading a lot about the Sodom and Gomorrah story for many centuries now. Okay, the second passage I want to talk about tonight, and some of the additional insights over the last 10 years. Um, so I think we're all familiar with the person that turns to the book of Leviticus to suggest um, that same-sex relationships is an abomination. Leviticus 18:22. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Now, if that's not strange enough, um, then a couple of chapters later, Leviticus 20, verse 13, is that it says that anyone who engages in same-sex relationship um, should be given the death penalty. Okay, pretty severe. Um, People think that this is pretty straightforward and they'll pull it out, but they ignore other things. Leviticus is a unique book, and I want to just talk about Leviticus for a second. The book of Leviticus really reflects Israelite religion, embodied really in what was received on Mount Sinai. Remember when the people they exit Egypt and they dwell in the Sinai Peninsula. They are there for 11 months and they are given the law. And over the course of that time, you have the type of commandments that are found in Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, which is the second giving of the law. When we quote a law from the book of Leviticus, we must take into account its historical and literary complexities. So, in the book of Leviticus, there are two parts. Chapters 1 through 16 is what's called the priestly part, the priestly edition, which talks about the role of the priests and the sacrifices. Chapters 17 through 24 is called the Holiness Code. And that's where you have all of these laws, including the ones that are at the bottom of the screen there. There's no eating of shellfish. You're not supposed to wear mixed fabrics. Those things too are called an abomination. We ignore all of those type of laws, but this one in chapter 18, verse 22, we hold on tight to. I mean, we as a church, the church of worldwide, and how hard they hold on to it depends upon where that church is by denomination and geography. Anyways, the thing to keep in mind is that Leviticus is not a mishmash of individual laws that have been loosely arranged. They have been grouped into three sets of 12 in these chapters, chapters 17 through 27. So three groups of 12, 36 speeches from God. And the Holiness Code it comes together over time. This isn't something that occurs all within that 11-month period of time. Not all these things were written at one time, but they were added to and they were structured by editors later. The Holiness Code, the best way to describe what the Holiness Code is what society believes is just gross, what grosses them out. Okay, so let's talk about abominations for a moment. So the word abomination in Hebrew is tobah, and its frequency is found most in the Levitical code. But it doesn't mean something morally horrific as much as something that offends the religious sense of a group of people. In other words, it's things that people find offensive. Don't do that. Okay, so the word abomination, when it's applied to shellfish and mixed fabrics and other individual things like that, is not a moral issue, but it is a cultural issue. We might suggest that in some societies in our world today, they find it offensive when a woman doesn't wear a head covering. Um, think about what happened in the campaign before President Trump was reelected. Remember what they came up with? They're eating cats. Do you remember that whole thing? You know, you can't trust the immigrant because they're going to eat your cats. That was J.D. Vance's line. Okay, why did he say that? It wasn't true. Why did he say that? Because it is gross in most people. Who would think about eating their dogs or their cats, but people that are offensive and people that we should reject? And so, in other parts of the world, there are people that eat things that we find offensive. I would never eat that type of thing. So, when you see the word abomination, you can see that it's used in three different categories here. It's used in ritual purity violations, such as unclean foods and mixing categories. That's the mixed fabric. You're supposed to keep things pure. You're not supposed to mix things together. Idolatry, um, the activity that often occurred at in temples that were of idols. And thirdly, both social and ethical violations. Now, what's interesting in the Levitical Code is you have not just this one commandment about um, sexuality, although chapter 18 of Leviticus is all about sexuality. And it seems as though the Israelites were very obsessed with genitalia because genitalia was all about reproduction and filling the earth as God had commanded the original couple to do. So they would naturally associate, you cannot carry out the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth unless you have sexual relationships only between a man and a woman. That's the only relationship that can produce the offspring that would carry out the fulfillment of this commandment. So the word abomination is used in all kinds of different things. Everything from dietary rules to injustice to idolatry and that type of thing. So what we find is that the Levitical code is kind of like a cultural boundary marker. Okay? We don't do this. And that's why J.D. Vance appealed to the idea of eating cats and dogs as part of the campaign trail because as Americans, we don't eat cats and dogs. They're our pets. But in other parts of the world, they eat dogs, cats, and other things that we don't. So what we find here are boundary markers for this group of people. Now, it's interesting, Paul will later disregard in Galatians 5, he talks about not being under the law, that these things can be disregarded because he's talking to Jews and Gentiles, not just to the nation of Israel. These markers seem to disrupt Israel's identity. I think that's probably the purpose of the Levitical code. This is who makes Israel Israel. Um, there's not a consistent ranking system here. In the holiness code, how is not eating shellfish the same as not having sexual relationships with someone of the same gender? And that's why people in the church will say, well, that's not a moral commandment. That is just a dietary law. You can disregard that. You can't disregard the other. It's interesting. One of the things that relate to genitalia, again, is the idea of circumcision. It goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. And what we find is that's a mark culturally of the Jewish people, a sign of the covenant. And to keep the covenant, males are to be circumcised. Many parts of the world don't continue this as an association with some type of covenant loyalty. In many ways, it's simply considered maybe a medical or health issue in our world today, but not for the Jewish people back then. It was very important. So, what is often meant in one society is often different in another. So, now that brings us to Leviticus 18. The structure of the passage, if you have a Bible, turn open to Leviticus 18. And I know, I mean, if you have insomnia, read this chapter because it's tough to work through. You're going to see all kinds of different violations of the Levitical code. It's not just verse 18 where, or 22, chapter 18, verse 22, rather. It's not just between two males. You can read down through the passage, and all of these things are considered a no-no. Verse 8, do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. Verse 9, do not have sexual relationships with your sister. Verse 10, do not have sexual relationships with your son's daughter. Different things like that. So who's your son's daughter? Your granddaughter. We would think these things, just like they did, to be gross. So the chapter is really talking about a whole bunch of different things. Everything from incest to adultery, child sacrifice, and then you have one thing about this same-sex prohibition. There's even in the chapter, if you want to keep reading, about bestiality as well. So in this chapter, you have an opening frame and you have a closing frame in Leviticus 18. And when you see that, you're going to get a feel for what this chapter is trying to do. So in verse 1 of chapter 18, then the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt. Oh, this chapter is looking back to their time in Egypt. It would be easy to accommodate their lifestyle practices. You lived there for 400 years, where you used to live, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. Do not follow their practices. And here's what they are. Now go down to the last couple of verses. The closing frame is everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their people. We're not going to have anything to do with you if this is the way you're going to live. All societies have that red line. If you do this, we want nothing to do with you. And that's what the book of Leviticus 18 is talking about. Boundary violations. And the other thing that's important to see here is the land defilement. So in Leviticus 18, it's interesting here when you read what's happening, it says here, you must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I'm the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. And then you go down through this, and when you get to verse 24, it says, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled. That's an important thing to keep in mind. The land is said to be defiled. It is suggesting that to violate this holiness code somehow destabilizes the ritual order in the land. So this is about system coherence. How are we going to hold our society together? And what I think is happening here is there is a connection between three things: God, the people, and the land. We often forget about the land, but the land is portrayed in the Old Testament as a place where God is dwelling among his people. Therefore, the land itself is holy, it's set apart. And if they fail to keep this holiness code, they defile the land. And if the land is defiled, they believed that the land would spit them out. In other words, into exile. And that's what happens later in the text. So I put this together later this afternoon. It's not in your notes, but this is a way of visualizing what Leviticus 17 through 26 is about. God says, I am the Lord. God's holy. And he says, my presence is among you. I'm going to dwell among you. And it's seen through fertility and stability in the land. He says, the land is mine. Keep it holy. But through disobedience, the land can become defiled, which will lead to exile. But you don't need to go into exile. And so the third component is the people. You be holy, be distinct through your laws, through your ethics, through your justice. And so these three things are kind of living in connection with each other. God and the land and the people, all three are critically important. And that is an interpretive thing that's very important to keep in mind. You can't X out the land and just talk about God and the people from Leviticus. The land plays an important part in this as well. So then it goes on and talks about these different sexual laws in chapter 18, repeats it in chapter 20. It's repeated again in various places. But I want you to notice in Deuteronomy, it's fascinating to me that it says in Deuteronomy, in a patriarchal society, that if a man rapes a virgin who isn't pledged to be married, he's not carted off and thrown into prison. His punishment is he must marry the woman himself. Now, in our day and age, rape is a felony, but not then. In Deuteronomy, a man's okay if he rapes a virgin as long as he marries her afterwards. Okay? So you get these type of laws and you go, oh my goodness. So here's how I'd like to sum up. I think in Leviticus 18:22, it's important to see that there is a close link between same-sex relations and the status of the women during that day. Do not lie with a male as one does with a woman. Now, this has led to some different types of interpretations. You know, is it sexual roles? Is it a general prohibition? Is it a specific action like anal penetration? There are all these different interpretations that are often thought about. The cultic activity is connected, though, possibly to temple practices, fertility rituals, and exploitive structures that took place in Egypt and among the Canaanites where they're going to. So the holiness code plays a critical part, and here's how I'd like to finish up tonight. I gave you a chart in your notes. So when you look at this verse in 18:22, in Leviticus 18, it was to maintain Israel's holiness and distinct identity as a boundary marker. By the time you get to the Second Temple Judaism, remember the first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. By the time you come to Herod's temple in the New Testament, this is reinforcing Jewish identity versus Gentiles. That's what Gentiles do. They have this type of relationship, male among male, that type of thing. Paul will take it in a different direction in Romans 1. We're not talking about that tonight. We'll look at that next week. And he begins to use that as a way of explaining human sinfulness in total, and as a consequence, the cosmic disorder. Among modern scholarship, as we fast forward all the way to our own day, they are saying, hold on now, you got to look at this historically, you got to look at this contextually, and it will depend on the interpretive framework that you're using as to what you think this verse is saying. So what we've done tonight, and I know I've taken a little bit over time tonight. We've looked at the passage in Genesis 19. We've looked at Exodus 18. Those are the two clobber passages. But the additional research in the last 10 years has helped us better understand what's going on in both of those passages than what took place 30, 40, 50 years ago. Okay. I am going to stop our recording at this point.